into the National Gallery once or twice, but sort of has no idea personally of like the wider ecology of the arts or what's going on in it. And it seems to be a trend in Australian politics that you get these people that inherit these portfolios, and the arts portfolio is this thing that, you know, gets sandwiched with
poorest arts minister that we had throughout that period, because he came from rock and roll and he never needed any handout ever, and was made a lot of money from it and was really successful, had an international career. So he thought he knew how it worked, and he was not responsive. And I think Simon Crean, actually, who replaced him or came a little later, he was one of the most effective. He finally got that arts policy up, and he was just a veteran politician who approached it like a job. And I think that's actually what we want in the arts, is someone who comes to it as, this is my responsibility, this is my job, I'll listen to everybody, I'll take it and I'll process it professionally. Brandis was another who really wanted, and Don Harwin in New South Wales, they really wanted the arts portfolio, and because they thought they had an idea about it, and then their biases came out. And
can you tell us what you think the attraction is for college?
Oh, it's very, well, it's, to some ministers it's very attractive because it's parties and it's being seen with fancy people. Well, totally, but that's true. They love to be seen around interesting people because they're not. So they true.
Probably. There's just on the other flip side of that, one of the most effective arts campaigning devices that I've seen is in the UK, and it came out of the conservative cuts to the arts when David Cameron got into power about 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago, and chapters started to pop up around the country called What's Next, because they wanted to mobilise the sector, and they wanted to start having conversations not just with themselves but with other industries. So I used to go to this chapter that was South Bank. You'd have all of the resident companies in South Bank, from the South Bank Centre to the Old Vic to the Young Vic, but also local artists. You even had major arts organisations, and they would come together every Wednesday morning at 8 a.m. They'd grab a coffee, they'd have a guest speaker come in, they'd talk about major issues facing the sector, but then start talking about something else. Brexit. Just, something might have happened the week before about major changes to adult social care. And they would start talking about that, because it was about the arts engaging with other industries and getting themselves outside of an echo chamber, so they knew what was going on in their community and knew what was going on in government. And it helped inform the way that they were talking to government and talking to each other.
I think that's so important, those conversations around that, which connects up your point and also to Dan's as well about, to what extent do we participate, in a certain structure, and to what extent do we try and, create something new. And that's about expanding the scope of our conversations and just getting a sense of, what others are doing, and, others in other fields, other industries. And that's now, that started as a few chapters, and they've developed all sorts of things.
Yeah, they've got chapters now up and down the country, from Scotland to Northern Ireland. They come together every year for What's Next conference, and they basically are quite powerful, with a very clear channel of communication from the broad brushstrokes of that sector right through to government and other industries.
More questions. Katie has her hand up, and then the person in the yellow. And I'm sorry, Celia, it's always the people who are like the furthest from where you happen to be standing with the mic.
So I guess my sort of question is around politicians' sort of understanding of arts and culture and national identity. And so the current arts minister has also created this fund to pour all this money into creating another monument to Captain Cook. And as a community, we don't necessarily feel like that is politically representing our position, but it's still a conservative understanding of like how they want to spend the arts budget. So, how do we break through that to talk to them, I guess, about like the politics of what we see arts and culture? Because I feel like it's a fallacy to think that conservative governments don't care about art. They do, but they care about art that maybe the broader art sector doesn't care about.
I don't know how to answer that. That was just, it was unbelievable that was included in the budget. And I don't know how you protest that, or maybe you write a letter. Maybe you write a letter to the arts minister, but I don't know how you make a stronger protest than that. I don't know.
One of the most powerful things that we haven't really touched on is the work of artists in protest, in commenting on what's going on. That's a really powerful tool as well. And I think that sort of stuff provides a really good inspiration to what you want to create, and I think it sort of opens up an artistic conversation.
And just on that, something that we've said has been quite important for our plan for the next few years is to think about how we amplify the voice of the artist into the national conversation. Sometimes that's about, artists accessing the media, arts organisations accessing the media, but sometimes it's also about, that culture that we don't quite have in Australia, where people approach artists for comment about things that aren't just arts issues. So where there are, artists who are known for making work about something in particular.
Ben Quilty, for example, I suppose.
Yeah, so we can probably name on one hand the artists who are regularly approached. Has anyone ever been approached by media, whether it's local or otherwise, about and about arts issues, and then we'll go to the person in the yellow. Patricia's putting her hand up, and there's also someone I can't quite see. A lot of waiting happening.
Just very quickly about reporting on artists doing work. And before I make the point, I wanted to connect.
I'm just going to interrupt because my question was, has someone been approached by media for comment? So if it's a new question, we will go to the person in the yellow shirt because he was first.
Oh, okay.
So,
Mr. Yellow Shirt.
I've been wondering about what we can, since the Yes campaign was brought up and the lobbying of friends and family that went over in that campaign, that was successful not because straight people were ready to gobble it up. It was successful because we were all emailing our friends and family and why that was an important issue. And often I think a lot of artists share the experience that we still have to explain to friends and family why it's a legitimate job. And what's more effective, lobbying for like what we can do every day. Yeah. Lobbying politicians or lobbying friends and family, and what's the critical moment to do both or either one?
I mean, it's almost like you're doing your own qualitative research in your messaging by talking to your friends, family, community about your practice. It's sort of inform the way that you talk to government as well. I mean, it's all the same. That for me is the same.
People often get into conversations with people who say when they're in a new city, they'll ask the people making their coffee or driving a taxi, because people in those jobs speak to lots and lots and lots of people, and so giving it a go to kind of think, oh, let's talk about a current issue in a way that's not the way that my friends would say. We started out talking about the echo chamber, and also those of us from family backgrounds who are just horrified about our career and sexuality choices, that you kind of I've had some very instructive conversations with family members that have genuinely inspired the way that I then talk to MPs, because it's like, I've been saying things in a way that has made sense to me for a long time, but that wasn't necessarily the way to appeal to someone who either is indifferent, doesn't agree with me, or is virulently anti what I'm talking about. Patricia.
So very quickly, and it was a question, but I'll lead to it. So in my view, the reason why the Yes campaign was so successful was because it was led by the government and the press. So people followed suit. And to me, that is inevitably the case. People can set the agenda, whether it's the community at large or small groups. They can set an agenda, they can try and start a conversation, but ultimately it is the people up the top who lead the conversation, and in any country it is the government and it is the press. The press has to do its job too. So that's why to me the Yes
campaign... Can I just say
campaign...
something on that? There was so much work that happened prior to government actually taking on that campaign for them to actually approve it. I mean, there was just so much work from the Human Rights Advice Service in Victoria, right, you know, through to gay rights in Sydney, working together, fundraising, working with business. I mean, the lobbying that went on for years before that actually happened enforced that change.
Leaders are very organised.
And you're right, but this also connects to then something else that you mentioned, that, you know, about stories for the press. Why does the press not cover artist stories? So social media platforms at the moment are absolutely going viral on the Clive Palmer billboards. And, you know, and whoever I talk to, and I'm seeing them everywhere. Some artist is carrying out an intervention on the Clive Palmer Make Australia Great billboards.
Oh, what are they doing? I haven't seen them.
Oh, they're incredible. And like they're all over social media. I haven't seen one single press reporting on this. Actually, one internet press, I think it's, I don't remember what it's called, talked about vandalizing. So, you know, it's how the press, and I don't mean to blame you, and I'm not even angry, this is a fact. It's the language that you use. Language shapes people's thinking from the government to the press, okay? So have a look, Clive Palmer's billboards. They're from Make Australia Great to Make Australia Great, you know, with the Parmesan graters, you know, to put Australia first, to put profits first. These are the kind of interventions. They're everywhere.
A really superb example of that in Australia is, those of us who are old enough to remember the 1980s Bugger Up campaign, which was a very well organised. I wish I'd known some of these artists who, you know, vandalised billboards all over Australia that advertised tobacco. It got to the point where you just could not expect to put up a tobacco ad anywhere in Australia without expecting an artistic response within a day.
I really loved, I don't know whether it had any effect or not, but I loved it, was the, you know, the Brandis in Art campaign.
The Art of Brandis.
Yeah, the Art of Brandis. I just loved it, you know, his face on everything, it was just hilarious.
All right, some more questions for these guys, and then I'm going to ask them to just give us some, you know, a couple of top tips to leave us with. But who has got a question? There is one from Shannon over there, also once again in the opposite end to where we are standing. We're passing the parcel, and then Peter will have a question.
I'll give you a top tip now. If you're going to invite MPs to things, just check out the sitting calendar. It's easy to Google. Australian Parliament House, APH, sitting calendar. You'll know whether they're going to be around or not.
That is a very good point, the sitting calendar, and also have a look at this week in Parliament, which lists what is being discussed by both houses every day, which was why I mentioned the unexplained wealth legislation that I haven't had a second to look up since I mentioned it. Shannon?
Can I just add that though? But I don't think, if you've got an event on, I don't think it hurts to send them an invitation anyway, even if they can't come, because it's about initiating a conversation with them. It's like a little pamphlet landing in their inbox so they know what you're doing. And, you know, they can't come to the first three because it's sitting week, so fourth one, it's not a sitting week, but they've got a narrative of you actually emailing them. So, you know, it's two ways, yeah.
Thanks. This is maybe branching on from things about being approached by media, but as individual artists and arts organisations do become more political and start to campaign on issues, etc., and participate in this debate, especially on issues of race, etc., they're going to be quite susceptible to attacks by certain parts of the press. And I don't think a lot of artists are prepared for what that experience is like. There are people in this room who have faced that fire and still kind of battle through it. But I wonder about advice in terms of facing those often really personal they put you physically at risk often because of how they focus publics that read certain presses. And I think it's probably worth hearing a little bit whether there's any advice for individuals who may face that unexpectedly.
So the question was, there are organisations and also artists who will be attacked in the media. We're thinking of an example in Melbourne recently where the tabloid paper attacked Seventh Gallery. There's of course...
what did they do?
Shannon, take us through the... Yeah.
So I guess they hosted an issue that discussed decolonisation. Right, so they had a panel participants who had been strident on issues of this in different formats, and they were kind of questioned on this. I guess I've experienced this in different ways over time. When I was growing up in Queensland, an artist was pursued by the Courier Mail because they were a performance artist, and they were kind of hounded by that paper into a nervous wreck, and that was something I sort of we grew up kind of in fear of. Attracting that attention. So I think it's just something to be aware of.
And then there's the social media stuff. I mean, I find that whole thing completely depressing and gradually shutting down each of the platforms I'm on. The conversation can be so vicious. I find that really hard.
So what are your thoughts in kind of, the readiness, I guess, the response that artists and organisations need to have when they are attacked by the conservative media for basically, doing the work, doing the job of the public cultural conversation. We can think of, I think, any number of columns by Andrew Bolt where it's just basically, or people like that, I'll make a lazy story this week, I'll just read the latest funding announcements of a certain funding body, and then I'll make a whole story just laughing at the names of the projects. Or you may have seen, either yesterday or the day before, I can't remember, I think it was the Australian Academy for the Humanities or one of the academic bodies put out a statement in response to, again, one of these articles where academics are laughed at for, pilloried for hosting conferences that touch on issues of race, gender, sexuality, etc.
I suppose when applying for funding and putting yourself out there, you need to run whatever those documents are that you're submitting, or whatever the idea is. Have somebody you trust, or your representative organisation, that run it by somebody, but then be aware that you are playing in a public forum and that we can't control things, what happens after it's out of your hands. So I'm not saying it's okay, I'm not defending it, but once you do submit something into a public arena, or you're applying for public funding, you're part of a wider conversation that you can't control anymore. So I know art is very personal, but the whole thing about playing in the public is that you have to steel yourself against whatever that reaction might be.
And when you say run it by them, you mean in terms of like how you would then respond?
Or just have somebody else interrogate it and say, I'm submitting this. How could it blow back in my face? What should I be prepared for? And then if somebody with some sort of rigour or some distance, and they might say, well, here's the thing, you're suggesting rolling 10,000 rolls of toilet paper up in a configuration, and maybe it would get a headline, shitstorm, whatever. How do you feel about that?
Very quick.
How do you feel about that? How would you feel about that? And if you've prepared yourself and worked through some of those scenarios, then you'll be a little bit stronger. But that's what the public forum, and I'm not saying it's okay, but that's what it is.
Yeah. Hi. Hi.
Just following up from the previous comment, I think one of the best pieces of advice, practical pieces of advice we got given as a PBA collective post making a work called Terrorist Training School back in 2003 or whenever it was actually from the Australia Council and their PR department, who basically said you need to write a list of the questions that you dread the most, that you kind of feel like, oh my God, or, you know, this would really floor me, and you answer them, and so you have it down. And the other tip they gave us was to never feel as though you have to respond straight away, that you can put the phone down on a member of the press and say, I'm going to think on that and get back to you, and it's your choice, so that you don't be put in that situation where you are feeling, you know, hounded or victimised or whatever. So that was really, really handy tips.
That's really great, thank you. Peter?
But I suppose it's part of letting something you've created go out into the world, that you'll have some wonderful feedback ultimately, but that there's also some stuff that you might not want, but if you have anticipated it, it will be easier to deal with.
Yeah, there's a question here somewhere. It's a bit of a comment. Just following on from the previous session of redressing inequity, and probably what I was talking about yesterday about a general sense of apathy is that. So I guess the question is, in terms of, particularly in the notion of First Nations and that place, how do you actually advocate when people don't really care, or there's a perception of people don't really care? And why I'm actually thinking about that, and all due respect to the panel, but there's another big campaign, constitutional recognition, treaty sovereignty. We don't really hear about that. I also heard this starting out about the Brandis issue. And look, you know, I might have drank from the Kool-Aid also, but that wasn't a cut. That was just a reallocation from Australia Council within the portfolio. The same year in the parliamentary budget statement, there was a 33.8% cut, $33.8 million cut, that the brunt of that was felt by the Indigenous programs. That is still being felt today. Within that area, we had Indigenous cultural support and Indigenous languages program subsumed into one, the new Indigenous language. There were cuts, real cuts, out of the arts budget that we're still feeling the ramifications today. And it was in the public domain, and no one actually, everyone was worried about the Brandis redirection. It wasn't a cut. A lot of organisations benefited from it. A lot of Aboriginal, I don't support it. I think it's set up a false economy that we're actually next year, once it goes through the process, we're going to actually hear and feel some real serious things coming out of it. But there's other things happening, particularly in First Nations. So how do you advocate and call on champions, supporters, when people have the perception that no one really gives a fuck? Or is the message is stiff shit?
I think a deadline can help. That creates urgency. So the Brandis cuts were coming. There was Black Friday. What are the timelines? The problem with reconciliation is what's the deadline? And sometimes you have to create those deadlines, whatever they might be. But media is a daily beast, or increasingly a minute by minute. But deadlines, create urgency, and then that prioritises that story over the next one, which has a deadline for tomorrow or the next day.
Well, while Nick's thinking of his response, one of the issues around, timing and deadline last year was, of course, that all the work and the focus of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which had a particular and strong and very clear timeline, the attention was then eclipsed by the marriage equality vote and the Yes campaign through absolutely no fault of the people who were campaigning for that. But I had so many conversations, I'm sure also with Peter at that time, where it was just, this work had been going for years and years. This was the timeline, that was the deadline. And then it's that kind of thing where you suddenly sit back and think, is Australia really that small? Has the media kind of, constrained to the point where we can only have one national conversation of some kind of cultural thing? How do we make sure that conversations like this don't stay in a place of apathy when it comes to political decision makers?
So I think it's about planting those seeds, and it was like when I referred to that What's Next program in the UK, what that is essentially doing is planting long-term seeds so that there is a continuing conversation that's happening, there's a continuing engagement, so that people hopefully do give a shit. And to Peter's point, when the cuts came through, there was 80 million straight out that was cut from the Australia Council, and then there was about 100 that went into the Department for Catalyst, and then there was those programs around languages. There was also an interactive games fund that was cut. There was a cut that went to supporting local arts champions to complement a still existing local sports champion program. I mean, there was a whole host of cuts that happened, but the kind of the thing that captured the imagination within the sort of bandwidth of the media was the Australia Council.
But it wasn't, I think that it also played into Brandis being, the Brandis bookshelves, so it continued that narrative of him being pompous and out of touch. So it's not, the story in it from a mainstream point of view was not about all these arts companies about to lose funding. It was this out of touch minister making a decision based on what, and now he's got, lots of people really cranky. So that's where it chimes. It's self-interest. People, or when it plays into an established narrative. Artist suffering is not a story. It's true. In the last couple of weeks, in New South Wales, there's been a really devastating funding round by Create New South Wales, resulted in 2.7% of applicants being funded, and I've been trying to get this story over the line with the television news guys, and they kind of go, artists suffering, yeah, and I've got all these great examples, and I've got pictures for you, and it's not a story that they can think that mainstream will have sort of sympathy for. So I need to come up with a more interesting, compelling way to frame it. So I've reframed it as arts funding round is disastrous, disarray at Create New South Wales, and that means that the performing companies can't tour in New South Wales. Drought-affected communities that could benefit from community building, some mental health outreach, some whatever right now, economic stimulants, aren't going to get it because Create New South Wales is in a mess. So that's how you can, how I can kind of get that story to play outside of just the arts, is by having a regional, rural, community impact story.
And for what it's worth, the Uluru Statement debate, I feel like is getting really good coverage. I mean, the ABC up in Ghana broadcasting live. Patricia Carvelis was grilling some minister 2 days ago about why does Turnbull keep turning down this, the Uluru Statement. Oh, without a doubt, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, and that's a great example of, it'll be an election year because we will make it one. And that's one where we all have to, I think, absolutely be behind and make sure that we're having the conversations, informally, but that we're also talking to MPs, to decision makers. Now, it's time to wrap up. I want to thank you both so much. This, again, is the kind of conversation that we could have for, a good long time, but it's just so important to hear about those kinds of, practicalities of how we work the particular existing systems, I mean, to hear Michaela even talk about how, like, you know, there's Michaela herself has got to also go through the process of pitching as news the arts. It's not just about, you know, our access to a journalist. It's about, you know, what constitutes news. And then Nick, thank you also for